let's go straight into it. I guess what we're looking to do is really, the idea was to get, some risk insights from some of the senior leaders and market, eminent market players in the market. I guess the first question we were really looking to get your insights on was how you describe the current local and global risk landscape and the outlook. Given your involvement in the WEF risk analysis, I think it would be useful perspectives.
Well, I think just if we start at that very global lens, it's been a really interesting, sharp turn from where we were this time last year, where we all thought we're getting into a better year in 2020 compared to 2019. And a head of steam had really built up around issues to do with climate. So if you saw the risk report from WEF last year, out of the first top 5 risks, 4 had something to do with the environment. So fast forward to this year and post-pandemic, a very sharp turn back to worries about the economy. So I will fully suspect that out of the top 5 this year, 4 will be fully something to do with economic performance, in particular issues around sort of depression even. I mean, we're talking about possibly a 1930s scenario, although I don't think it's going to be quite that dire. We are talking about a rise in inequality as a result of that, talking about the suddenness with which this big shift that we've all been knowing is coming into digitization has suddenly come upon us, the impact on inequality and people with no access. And all of those factors potentially playing into frisons and fractures in societies. So in my mind, you've got really the 3-legged part, if you like, the economy being a very central one, leading to really, really poor health outcomes in the short term, but lasting scarring when it comes to societal relations and societal cohesiveness. And you've seen this in America, how once you rupture a society along very strong lines, they don't need to be political necessarily, they can be economic, such as we see in South Africa, it's very difficult to pull that back together again. So I think the world we're going into in 2021 is one that's going to be hugely, much more so, in fact, than in the past, defined by division. So what do I see? On the one side, the economy is the driver of the biggest risks that we have to manage. And on the other side, the societal impacts aren't going to go away just because you've now solved the economic issue.
Just back to the point around planet, it's certainly, we've also seen that, almost global groundswell, and it's taking hold in Africa now. With that sort of taking a back seat, do you see it as something that's coming back in the short term? Clearly, the economy and the macroeconomic issues are at front of stage, but is that something that will continually boil under?
Well, I don't even think under, Mark. I think that the climate isn't going to go away. So it may be that the spotlight shifted, but I think that shift is a very, very short term, because we now actually have come to understand and accept that the damage to the environment requires solutions now. It can no longer be postponed. So I see that actually as part of the suite of risks that will be at the forefront in 2021. So I said 4 of the 5 because I'm quite clear that the 5th would still be climate-related impacts, well, climate change itself, and then the weather impacts thereof. And the reason I think that has to be the case is, even as we are busy navigating our way through the pandemic, through the economic fallout from that, weather events aren't going away. They're actually even more present than ever before. So it's part and parcel of, I think, the landscape. The geopolitical tension has always been with us. It flares up and then it kind of diminishes over time. and also depending on the quality of leadership we may have at that time, whether it serves their interest to egg it on or to contain it. So that's been one of the big macro trends, I think, that drives global events. What I see in this next, well, so firstly, I'm not one of those who think that globalization is dead and never will come back. I don't think globalization is going anywhere. I just think that the flavor of globalization that we're going to now start seeing will be slightly different. So people will be much, much more mindful about what are those things actually that can drive our economy as a country now or as a region over the cliff. It's certainly not having access to vaccines or PPE when there's a health epidemic. And so we may start to see those supply chains getting more regionalized and getting shorter. But the demand across the globe by consumers for the cheapest of everything and the most technologically advanced, immediately available of everything will continue to drive the big technologically driven innovations global. It has nowhere else to go. We in Africa could not replicate an Apple phenomenon, so 5G's come out of China. That genie's out of the bottle. Even if they don't want to deal with Huawei, somehow the world has got to find a way to incorporate those technological innovations. So the big issues in my mind will continue to be global, but within that, there will be space for more regionalized solutions for things that really are closer to people in times of crisis. In 5 years' time, we would have forgotten about coronavirus, and those regional flows will go back to global as well, because by then the driver again will be cost. It's always been about cost. So I think though this will be happening at a time when China is no longer the cheapest producer of manufactured goods, right? So that was in any case a trend even pre-pandemic. So what will be accompanying this sort of interregnum, for lack of a better word, is you will find a lot more diffusion of manufacturing bases, some of them remaining in Southeast Asia, your Vietnams, your Indonesias, etc., but increasingly some moving to sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe I should say Africa as a whole, but in particular sub-Saharan Africa. And the sub-Saharan African countries that I think will be winners in this next phase will be those that recognize and act to pick up the slack, such as Ethiopia. Ethiopia was a very early adopter in this phase. South Africa recognizes it, but South Africa does not appear to have the flexibility in its labor structures to be able to afford themselves the opportunity. But it's a massive, big opportunity in this decade. It's not a matter of the next decade. It is happening as we speak.
All right, then. So thank you very much. I think that was very insightful. Just moving on to the next question, then. You obviously have a number of roles. So perhaps give us a view of a synthesis of that. From in terms of what comes to mind. But if you think about, you spoke about obviously the financial risks and the profitability. That's a real critical issue. Are there any other risks? If you had to raise or highlight another risk that potentially is most impacting business strategy and performance at the moment, what would that be?
Well, I think that clearly the future has always been unknowable by definition, right? So we at this time of the year, most boards sit around and think, what kind of world are we confronting in the following period, and how can we best position ourselves to take advantage of opportunities that come down the line? This year, across all the boards on which I serve, the future became even more unknowable. So the level of uncertainty about the future has meant that for most boards, actually, for the first time in a long time, they are confronting issues of, can our business model fail? Is it actually the right way to be structuring our resources, processes, people, and capabilities for this world that's coming down the line? I don't think I've seen this before in quite such a sharp way. So whether the company is fit for purpose in terms of how it's structured and has been traditionally structured. Can they remain competitive? So it's been quite a big theme of this round. Clearly, if you are in South Africa, issues of governance loom large. I think the largest that we've seen in recent times, even during the Zuma years. And that might be because of a confluence of issues. And remember, as human beings, we pay attention to what is in front of our faces or our eyes. And because there is state capture at Zondo Commission on a daily basis, because the JSE is suddenly levying fines on the EOHs and the Tongas, suddenly we think the world's coming to an end because everybody's corrupt. So whether it is that corruption has become a bigger issue, governance failures at boards have become a bigger issue, is a moot point. The issue is we perceive those issues to be at an all-time high, and therefore, if we don't see ways to row back on governance and corruption, I think in the new year, we're also going to start to see lasting impacts on the fabric of our society. But this is a very, very South African issue. I'm not trying to generalize this one. So I think in South Africa, governance, and I actually couple governance and corruption because they do tend to be two sides of a coin.
Yeah, it's a governance failure, basically.
Yeah, the other day I participated in a corruption watch event where they do, it's not an annual thing, they do a dipstick of disclosure, of transparency on the issue of corruption amongst corporate boards. So clearly, there's a lot of companies doing really well on this governance issue, or at least disclosures about it, but we still have a long way to go, even in the private sector. But I think it would be true that for the average Miss and Mr. South Africa citizen, it is the government corruption that's an issue. So then you're coupling corruption in the public sector together with a particularly weak fiscal position. So it's easy to see that government could fall over the cliff in no time because they don't have much fat there that you can whittle away. You combine that with the weaknesses in the balance sheets of very large state-owned enterprises that therefore require support from the government. You couple that with government is fighting on many fronts, the latest one being the public sector wage. So there is a feeling, I guess, of turmoil in the environment of a level that we haven't experienced in the recent past, other than I think at some point during the time, for example, of Mbeki being recalled. I think the last time I felt South Africa being in this NC knife's edge kind of way was in 2007 when the ANC recalled the president. So I think there is a sense in my mind that South Africa is in a very fragile state, and that is a huge risk because if any one of those things did fall over, it's very easy for the rest of the house of cards to collapse. And I think this is a bit, going to what is the worst that could happen. And so you let your mind just kind of play it out. I don't think that's exactly what does happen in the real world, but I'm just saying we should not take for granted that this country is on a sufficiently strong foundation that things can continue the way they are indefinitely. Something fundamental needs to change.
Perfect. So you've actually highlighted a number of the the risks that we're sort of profiling this year in the report. Are there any other risks that sort of sprung out at you? You spoke about governance failure, corruption. Was there any other risk that jumped out at you as a critical risk to need that organizations and South Africa and Africa needs to address?
You had some risks that I didn't didn't resonate with me, like shifts in consumer behavior. Well, that's perhaps a risk for some, but an opportunity for others. But I didn't think that it was it required as much attention, but certainly cyber attacks, I thought that was going to be a bigger issue, perhaps than even today. We think, I mean, you're already seeing this. It's bigger and longer lasting and more sophisticated cyber attacks, but as the preferred way of the fraud networks around the world. And why? Because of the economic situation. Financial distress is likely to drive that. So that one is, but also because I serve on the board of a bank, and this for them is like number one or number two. So that is a really big issue. So let me just tell you of the ones that so and I want to come back to this leadership point just in a minute. So I completely agreed with you, number 2 and number 3, which was the governance and corruption. I was lukewarm on number 4 insofar. I don't know whether these are ranked or not, but if it's ranked number 4, I didn't really see that. The NHI, I'm not sure since it doesn't exist. Structural inequality is the one that I thought was underclapped in this report. And actually, at no stage did I see social unrest potentially, and just dissonance amongst. And so that whole point I made right at the beginning, the divisions in society getting more and more extreme over time, and therefore difficult to roll back. And I would couple that with the youth unemployment, which you do capture the youth under pressure and the lost generation. So we are busy right now generating an entire generation that's got nothing to lose, no stake in the economy of their country, nothing to lose. This is how revolutions happen. Those people don't start the revolution, but those people are cannon fodder for the revolution. You've seen this in the US. We have a very, very recent template for that. Disruptive technologies, of course, always been there. So look, I think some of them I agreed with strongly, and others I thought, okay, I'm not sure. I would have a tier 2, sort of band of risks, and put some of them in there because there is much a potential opportunity for particularly the business sector as they are a potential risk. But let's just circle back to your scarcity of leadership, which actually is the one that resonated with me the least, believe it or not. I don't know that I can quite in my mind grasp the notion of the scarcity of leadership as a risk. Leadership, first of all, is situational. So we can never, you can put 4 people in a room and say to them, define for me what is leadership, and you get 4 different answers, because leadership means different things to different people, and leadership at a point in time during a war is very different at a point in time during something else. So if you can't even define the thing that is causing you to think there's a risk, then I question to what degree you can come to the conclusion that the thing's a risk. So leadership, it cannot be a risk, because it doesn't have to be quantifiable. So I can quantify the financial impact. I may not be able to quantify structural inequality, but even if it's unquantifiable, it's still a risk because I can define it. Leadership, I cannot define in quite that crisp a way, at least not in a crisp way that everybody can agree on. Secondly, there are many instances you can think up where you had extremely weak leadership and extremely good outcomes. Vice versa is also true. You could have very strong leadership and exceptionally poor outcomes. So leadership is a difficult concept to draw a causal line between this is what happened and this was the effect. It doesn't have quite as straightforwardly a causal relationship. There's a very high correlation, I agree, but it is not a causal factor. Thirdly, it's a modulating factor. So it is the absence of good leadership at a point in time that may mitigate the worst outcomes of a risk, or its presence mitigates and its absence aggravates. So it's far more if we are in this issue of climate change, let's take one that does not cause too much heat, right? And suddenly you have a good leader who understands that. A good leader to me will be the one who understands it. Obviously, if you don't believe in climate change, a good leader is the one who doesn't. But let's assume you get a good leader who does understand it. You get an Al Gore coming and becoming US president. You can then see that as a collective, you can take actions to mitigate that risk. So to me, leadership is in that role. It is going to be the one that will cause us to come to blows as a society sooner because we have failed to manage some things or not. So can you take all of that and say, okay, well, if that all of that is true, you can then isolate leadership as a standalone risk? That's where my mind couldn't compute. I couldn't make that jump. And I guess I would need to hear other people who think differently from that, who could argue the opposite point. So your number one to me was an underpin to all of the others rather than a standalone risk.
Then I think the last question we did touch on a bit, so maybe I'll end off with the, what insights, have you gleaned from the global pandemic and how that's impacted on the future? I know you also covered some of those right up front, but are there any other insights that, the lessons learned? I personally, have spoken a lot to my clients about the positives. There are lots of negatives about COVID, and the pandemic, but there's also a lot of opportunities that have potentially translated.
Well, hopefully that will come too. But for now, what we are dealing with is really the negative consequences. What have I learned the most? I guess sometimes you learn a lesson that you've already known, but you need a reminder. And that as human beings, we can, and indeed very often do, become our best selves under a crisis. The kind of pulling together, lack of dissonance in the social discourse in April and May in South Africa, we hadn't seen for years. This is a country that thrives on being on each other's throats, and for a change, everybody was pulling in the same direction. We had, in a matter of days, a solidarity fund. We had business and government working together collaboratively for the first time in a very long time. Take it down to the level of a firm. People were going home to work from home, not a very convenient switch by all means in all instances, but no complaints. People were productive. So I just had to, again, just take away that we can be so great. Where is that greatness at all other times? So that's not just a pandemic of this nature, but a crisis which we all had to suffer together. So that was the first thing that I took away. The second thing is that corporates in South Africa primarily, but I think globally, have not wrestled sufficiently well with their employees to understand the fragility in mental health in our society. So the impact that I expect to see continuing is on the mental health side. And when you ask boards and CEOs, what have you done about mental health amongst your staff? Oh yeah, we've got ICAS. It's not enough. It's not an adequate response. So that's the second aspect that I think we're going to have to be dealing with for some time, is the fragility in individual lives and family lives that have really been writ large through the crisis. On the positive side, I thought that the ability of even older people, I'm not just talking about millennials and technologically savvy people, to grapple with technology. Actually, we've underestimated that ability for a very long time. I mean, South Africa went from 10 to 12% e-commerce to 60% overnight. That is definitely something we should be doing much, much more about in the future. I would agree with you that there are significant opportunities for companies to rethink their business models, to take advantage of a public and a consumer base that is actually quite prepared to do things very, very differently from the ways that they have done it before. I also, on the leadership front, learned solid lessons about having to deal with the leader that you have, not the one you wish you had, because clearly there is a time when we were well led through the crisis where the leadership style and temperament was right for the moment, and there were times when that was not the case any longer, and there was just absolutely nothing we could do about that. That we were stuck in that particular situation. Finally, I mean, there's a lot. We could go on for a while, but let's not. Finally, you had the NHI in. Well, actually, you talked about National Health Service. I'm thinking NHI, National Health Service, which you've put as a failure to reform it. I think what I would take forward is the dire need to reform the national health infrastructure in this country. And I mean, we shouldn't be having the Eastern Cape right now, but we do as a second surge. They never really actually got out of the first surge, but the issue there is a completely dysfunctional, in fact, I would say collapsed health service. So for South Africa, so I started off saying you knew these things, you know them even better. We knew this, right? We can't say that the pandemic helped us to do that. So those are all the things I think that swirl through my head. If I take one level up, abstraction one level up, because we are talking about risk, is how will, having gone through what for most of us was not a risk on our risk registers, how does that change enterprise risk management practice in the immediate aftermath of this whole thing? And that I don't know the answer to. And so this is why I was hoping to talk to Nicola, because we could fashion an answer for ourselves at the JSE. But as risk practitioners the world over, we do need to think about what is it about our risk management processes that we can change in order to maintain this flexibility for these swan events. We still just don't know how to deal with them, I'm afraid. We saw this in 2008 with the financial crisis. As human beings, this is not a skill that we have. How do we develop it? Because it's very clear this is not going to be the last. Many companies, one of the companies on which I serve, Anglo, did actually have a pandemic as part of their risk register. But even having it, didn't then have anything else. So if a pandemic, then what? So they just had it there as part of the furniture, but not thought through what it means in the real world. So the negative, well, I think that in a year's time, if IRMSA is working with client organization to say, well, how has your practice learned from managing the pandemic? That would be a very useful line of thinking to take the practice generally forward.
Thank you very much. I mean, I guess it speaks to resilience. So a lot of the resilience practices have been very operational as opposed to strategic. And, it's about agility. You can't prevent every risk. You can't cater for every risk because it's not cost effective. It's about being agile, as you said. Thank you very much. We certainly have got some solid food for thought.
Thanks so much for that, Nku. I think it was really useful. I think specifically maybe to answer the last question and join that conversation, my answer would have been pretty similar to Mark, and that's really why when I've stepped into the role, I wanted to make sure that we've got an integrated risk and resilience management, because I think there's a lot of the tools that we can leverage in the resilience space that can help us look into the future. And yes, like Mark said, I mean, we won't be able to prevent everything, but we will be able to do some stress testing, scenario planning, all of those sorts of things. And in those things, you have to put plans together for the worst case. And so I think just focusing more on the resilience space will certainly up our game in that regard. And we might not necessarily forecast the next black swan or whatever other event hits us, but we would at least have plans that is more structured for any elements that could potentially affect us. So I think I would have probably had a similar response.
Well, which I buy. I think the resilience lens is probably the only practical one can use. But you then have to just probe a bit further and say, but in our business continuity plans, we do, for instance, have a means for employees to work from home in the case of, because I think that was the 9/11 lesson, right? That you should be able to take people away from their place of employment to take them somewhere else and be able to revive your system so people can work. So we have that in our plans. But when it came to actually implementing this at scale, yeah, so it's being a little bit more scenario planning about it in a way than planning. You know what I'm saying? So playing other, so the kind of thing that you're doing now, where it all starts with a scenario plan and start imagining this, and then say practically what would this mean, may be part of the answer.
So for me, the key thing is to test your plan. So we are going to start doing quite extensive testing. I think at some point in time, I might become quite unpopular because I'm taking people away from their day-to-day. But the reality is you don't build a resilience or resilient culture and approach if you don't actually test it.
One of the other insights that I've seen, in my day job is that a lot of, the first line executives, the accountability and ownership of risk is something that's come through quite strongly. And the challenge to the risk function, so it speaks to accountability, is risk embedded in your day-to-day, and how does the risk function support you in that? So the less mature organizations are asking, well, where was risk management? They're still blaming risk management as a function as opposed to, where's my accountability to run this business? Have I thought about what could happen?
I own the risk. So I think the answer will be resilience and combining that very much with what you do on the risk side, but it's also culture, which we didn't talk about today, and that's what you've just alluded to, Mark. So risk culture has got to be the new mantra as well as we move forward. Thanks, Mark. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for listening to my grievances.